It's month 4 of Praxis, and we're going over philosophy. So what is philosophy? One of the pieces of content we consumed this week was philosophers defining philosophy for themselves, many different philosophers, and hardly any of them had the same definition. I went through, took all of their responses, and put it into a word cloud, which gave me kind of an idea of what the most used words were so that I could make my own meta definition. And that definition was that philosophy is to think about a subject in order to ask a question and get answers about the world and people that is going to give you understanding, a better, in order to make sense of the world and people, and to gain wisdom, for you to gain wisdom in that area. So to think about a subject in order to ask questions and get answers about the world and people so that you can make sense of the world and people and gain wisdom. There we go, that's concise. So my personal definition of philosophy is more along the lines of philosophy being the system we use to take in new information, put it through, and understand it, how it relates to us, how it relates to others, how it relates to the world. So this system of thought can be used for any subject, just so long as that's the way that we break down new information. So everyone does have is kind of a philosopher. They just have different levels of thought out philosophies in their life. The concepts we covered this week were one about, the first piece was about giving a new idea 5 minutes. The author said that we often will push back on ideas as soon as we get them, as soon as other people present them to us, and that instead we should give it at least 5 minutes to think about it, to, think about, what if I held this idea? Why does this person hold this idea? What would it mean for my life? What does it mean for the world? And give it 5 minutes of thought to see if you still want to push back on it in the way that you did, or if you might actually have a lot to gain from it. The second piece was about the work required to have an opinion, which kind of expounded on this idea of understanding why you push back on ideas. And when you have an opinion that causes you to push back, then you should understand all of the alternatives to that opinion, all of the opposing arguments, better than your opponents understand them themselves. Because once you understand the opposing side better than your opponents, and you still hold your original position, or if you hold, if you end up holding a position, then you want to understand the opposing side. And that means that you've put in the work needed to hold that opinion and to defend it. The third piece was about how wrong we are, going over historically how wrong even the geniuses in our society have been. And scientifically, what psychologically in our brain we might not be understanding fully. Because of how our brain works, we're not actually consciously getting all the information that's in there. There's lots of different stuff that goes into how we believe things, how we perceive things, that we don't really even know how it works. So oftentimes we're wrong about what we believe and why we believe it, and what we even know that caused us to believe it. So that was talking about how, we've been wrong fundamentally on so many things, but it means that we're still able to learn and always take in new information, because you never know when you might be wrong. The fourth piece was on why philosophers make formidable entrepreneurs. Because of the way they think, they're often very good problem solvers and able to take in a lot of new information, find new solutions or new ideas, and connect with other people in a way that if you don't have a philosophical mindset, you might get stuck along the road. The fifth piece was the one I talked about earlier, with the philosophers defining philosophy for themselves. And the sixth piece was on constructing a useful hypothetical. People often dismiss hypotheticals because they don't seem like real situations. But he gave a case that you can either use a hypothetical to be an example of a real situation that you're able to apply, or to be an example of a fake situation that cuts down on the complexity of a much bigger issue. The arguments that the authors gave for their ideas were in a lot of different categories. Many gave personal experience or anecdotal evidence for their opinions, for their ideas. In the Give It 5 Minutes, it was an anecdote about the author going to a speech, pushing back on someone's ideas, and then having that person say, well, give it 5 minutes first. That led him to this idea, and then anecdotal evidence of how it had worked in his own life, as well as in the Why Philosophers Make Formidable Entrepreneurs. This person had met many formidable entrepreneurs and realized that most of them had philosophical backgrounds. There was also logic and evidence used, especially in the How Wrong We Are. Went through a lot of historical evidence on the geniuses in our society and how they've been wrong, what's historically we've been wrong about, and then scientifically how our brain works and how that means we might also be very wrong about what we believe. The ideas that were new to me, I went through this content a few months back, so a lot of it I have already been exposed to, but one idea that I had not caught the first time was in How Philosophers Make Formidable Entrepreneurs, that talked about how philosophers can make deeper team connections as entrepreneurs because they understand how their own presuppositions affect their decisions and values. And that means that they're able to find people on a much deeper level who are working towards the same goal because they understand it in the same way, instead of just going on face value. And that can help them to connect with other people and make a team much more easily than people who do not have a philosophical background. What new questions did this content bring up for me? It makes me want to know how to construct a good hypothesis, a good hypothetical, how to construct a good hypothetical, one that's going to cut through a complicated issue and kind of shed light on just two facets of that issue. What if this was here and this was here? What would that mean? Instead of trying to look at all the different factors that go into it. You just want to ask one hypothetical, and that's going to shed light. I want to know how to do that, because there's a lot of complex issues facing our society, and I think that proper use of hypotheticals could help. So the content made me curious about that. Did this content in any way change how I think about the world, and how? The most fundamental way it made me change how I think about the world is that in reading in hearing how wrong we are because of how our brain perceives things and how it what our consciousness and subconsciousness and the right and left sides of our brain are all doing together, made me think about how visually our brain constructs the data that we're seeing. We're not seeing the raw data that's out there when we look at something. Think about when you look at an abstract painting. It just looks like a bunch of brush strokes. You can't see what it is until you kind of squint, you look at it, and then you see, oh yeah, okay, that's kind of like a farmhouse. It's got the little roof, it's got the grass, and from that point on, when you're seeing it, you're not really seeing the brush strokes, the raw data of what it is anymore. You're seeing your brain's interpretation of it. Visually, you're seeing your brain's interpretation of it. And that leads you to believe that your brain is actually projecting a much different image than what's in real life. And I know there's other evidence that supports this, that your brain is basically piecing together the data you get to give you a visual field that's sometimes not even close to what you're actually seeing. So that really fundamentally changes the way you see the world. Literally. And so what are some ways I can use these ideas even if I didn't agree with them? This comes to the Give It 5 Minutes speech, because I'm often very reluctant to give things 5 minutes if I don't agree with them. Because, especially with issues that I believe may be harmful, such as recreational drug use and abortion, things that I am fundamentally against, and I don't really want to entertain them for 5 minutes because fundamentally I think that they are very harmful, and I don't want to, even let the slightest bit of that into my life, because I've seen, I've seen evidence that convinces me at this point it's very harmful. But, seeing with the opinion, the work required to have an opinion talks about how I should know those sides better than my opponents know that side. Instead of shying away from the information, I should not just be giving it 5 minutes, but really fundamentally understanding why people hold that position and what it means for my opinion. Even if that means changing my views. So that's the way that I can use the idea is by actually putting in the work to give it at least 5 minutes and helping it bolster my own opinions if I end up not agreeing with it after understanding the opponent's argument. Lastly, what connections are there between ideas I consumed this week and ones that I already knew? So this week's content did coincide with some ideas I've been formulating and kind of content I've been consuming along the side. One part being that in understanding our opponent's arguments better than they do, there was a different piece of content that I was looking at about a feminist who was creating a film on men's rights activists, and who through that film came to understand their side and view them as human, because before she had been thinking they were all monsters and, against women, but they weren't. They just believed women had a different role in society, and that there were different ways that this affected how people should live in real life. But they weren't going for inequality. They were going for equality in different ways. So that was one way that she was understanding her opponent's arguments. And kind of seeing how that can bolster her own side, can kind of give her different input on why she is a feminist, but also help her understand her own arguments better, so she's not arguing against this vague idea of a men's rights activist, but she is, kind of giving both sides of the issue. So that's the content that I consumed this week in Praxis, and I look forward to making another video for Praxis Week 2.